I did not sleep the night they executed General Mara Vass. Nobody did. I was sitting in the operations room of the carrier ship Endurance, 3 light years from the Varath border, reviewing fuel supply reports for the Terran fleet's outer quadrant patrol schedule. The screen flickered to life without warning. No announcement, no preamble, just the cold white light of the Varath high chamber flooding every screen across 40 star systems at once. Fuel reports. I remember thinking how ordinary that was, as if the galaxy were not about to change completely. She was already standing when the broadcast began. Mara Vass stood in the center of the Varath chamber with her hands at her sides and her chin level. She wore her uniform, not the diplomatic dress they had probably offered her. Her actual uniform, gray and worn at the cuffs, with the 3 gold bars of a Terran general on her collar, and the small silver pin of the Vass family crest just below her left shoulder. She had chosen it deliberately. That was the kind of woman she was. Every detail was a decision. She was 53 years old. She had spent 30 of those years in service to humanity. She had negotiated the Aldara Corridor Agreement, which stopped a resource conflict that would have pulled 6 species into open confrontation. She had personally walked into a Vorath detention camp on Sector 9 to secure the release of 11 human researchers. She had been the first and only human ever awarded the Vera Imperium Honor Seal, a disc of pressed starlight alloy that their High Council gave to fewer than 20 individuals in their entire history. They were using that same chamber to end her. The Varath High Chancellor stood behind the elevated bench in his ceremonial robes, a tall figure named Brethine. He read the verdict in a flat, practiced tone. Seditious consultation. The words meant nothing. Legal decoration on something that had been decided long before any trial began. The Varath Empire had been quietly expanding its territorial claims in the outer reaches for 2 years. Mara had been the loudest and most credible voice telling the Terran Assembly what was coming. She had been exactly what a good general is supposed to be. And that was the problem. Mara listened to the verdict. She did not flinch. She did not look at the floor. She looked directly at the broadcast lens, which meant she was looking at every human being watching across the galaxy. Her expression was the calmest thing I had ever seen on a person facing what she was facing. The execution was not violent. The Varath do not do things violently when they are performing them for an audience. It was a pulse of energy from a suspended projector above her, clinical, swift. She was there, and then she was not. They cut the broadcast immediately after. No lingering image, no comment. The screen went black, and then it went back to whatever routine system data it had been showing before, as if nothing significant had happened. I sat there for a long time. My operations officer, a young man named Callum Hart, stood in the doorway. I did not hear him come in. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. He was 26 years old, and he had grown up learning about the Pax Galactica the same way all of us had, as the fundamental background condition of human life among the stars. 847 years of structured peace. 847 years of careful, deliberate coexistence built on a treaty that Mara's ancestor, Commander Lyria Vass, had negotiated at the end of the founding conflicts. 847 years of humans choosing again and again to step back from the edge. Callum stood there, and I could see in his face the exact moment he understood that something was over. Not just a person, not just a general, something larger, something that had held the shape of the galaxy together for longer than any living being could personally remember. I pulled up the Terran emergency frequency. It was already active. Every senior officer across the human fleet had been silently patched in the moment the broadcast ended. I could hear breathing. 40, maybe 50 people. No one was talking. We were all just listening to each other exist in the same stunned silence. Then Admiral Sierra Akefer's voice came through, quiet, steady, the way she always sounded. "Hold your positions," she said. "Hold your discipline, do not act alone, we will speak soon." That was all. I closed the channel and looked out the narrow viewport to my left. Space was dark and still, the way it always is, indifferent to what happens inside the small metal ships moving through it. I could see the edge of the Varath border marker in the far distance, A cluster of red navigation lights burning steadily as they always had. I thought about Mara Vass standing there in her worn uniform with her chin level and her eyes forward. I thought about 847 years. And I thought about what it means when you ask a patient people to be patient for too long. Callum was still standing in the doorway. I finally looked at him. He was waiting for something. Not orders, not reassurance. He was just waiting for me to acknowledge that we both understood what we were sitting inside right now. "Get some rest if you can," I said. He nodded and left. He did not get any rest. Neither did I. I sat in that operations room until the next shift began, and I wrote 3 things in my personal log. The first was Mara Vass's name. The second was the date. The third was a sentence I had never expected to write in my career. They just ended 847 years of us being patient. I did not know then what that meant in specific terms. I did not know the scale of what was coming, but something in me, something old and quiet and very human, already understood that the Varath Empire had made a mistake so large that no amount of diplomacy would ever fully measure it. They had looked at humanity and seen what they wanted to see. A species that talked instead of acted. A species that wrote reports and filed grievances and attended committee meetings. A species that had not started a war in 847 years and therefore, they concluded, would not start one now. They did not understand that those 847 years were a choice, and they had just helped us unmake it. There is a question that people outside our species have always asked quietly among themselves. Why did they stop? They mean the early period, the first century of human expansion into deep space before the founding conflicts, before the Pax Galactica. They mean the era when humanity was moving outward with the kind of energy that does not slow down easily, building, claiming, pushing. They ask why we stopped. The honest answer is that we did not stop because we were forced to. We stopped because Lyria Vass walked into a room 847 years ago and made a different choice. And every generation after her made the same choice over and over because we understood what the other option looked like. And we decided we did not want to be that. But here is the part they never quite understood. Choosing not to do something is not the same as being unable to do it. I have spent 31 years in the Terran fleet. I know what our ships are built to do. I know that the average human soldier carries a physical endurance significantly higher than most species we have encountered. I know that our engineering divisions have been quietly refining propulsion and weapons systems for 3 decades, always within the technical limits that the Pax permitted, always careful, always measured, and always advancing. The Varath Empire mapped our active fleet every year. They counted ships. They assessed crew numbers. They knew exactly how many vessels we had and where they were positioned. What they did not count was the shipyards, 17 of them, distributed across human space in locations that were not secret but were also never prominently discussed. Stations capable of full warship construction, dormant mostly, in the way that very large and capable things can sit quietly for a long time without announcing themselves. The infrastructure was maintained. The workers were employed on other projects. The systems were tested on a rotating schedule. We had not been preparing for a war, but we had never stopped being ready for one. The day after the execution, I received orders to report to Relay Station Delos for an emergency assembly of the Terran Joint Command. I left Callum in charge of the Endurance and took a courier ship. The journey took 4 hours. I spent most of it reading Mara Vass's last 3 strategic reports. They were extraordinary documents, not because of their conclusions, which were correct. They were extraordinary because of how carefully she had framed them. She had known, writing them, that she was describing a threat. She had also known that naming that threat too loudly would itself be used as provocation by the Varath. She had threaded the needle perfectly, specific without being aggressive, clear without being inflammatory, and they had executed her anyway, because she was right, and because a woman who is right in ways that are inconvenient to an empire is more dangerous than any weapon. Relay Station Delos is not a glamorous place. Gray corridors and recycled air and the permanent background hum of long-range communication arrays. When I arrived, the main assembly hall was already full. 240 senior officers. Most of them I knew by name. All of them I knew by reputation. Nobody was talking. That was the first thing I noticed. In 31 years of attending military briefings, I had never once walked into a room full of 200 people and heard nothing. That morning in that hall, nobody said a word. They stood or sat, and they looked at the floor or the walls or the middle distance, and they were each individually doing what humans do when they are very angry and very controlled at the same time. They were holding it. Admiral Sierra Akefer came in 7 minutes later. She was 61 years old, short and broad-shouldered, with gray hair kept close and the kind of posture that makes rooms reorganize themselves around her presence. She walked to the front of the room. She stood there for a moment, looking at all of us. Then she spoke. General Mara Vass was a soldier, a diplomat, and the clearest strategic mind of her generation, Akefer said. She was executed by the Verath Empire on a fabricated charge in a public broadcast designed to demonstrate to every species watching that humanity can be managed, that our concerns can be dismissed, that our people can be removed without consequence. She paused. They were wrong. Another pause. Recall every active treaty negotiation. Suspend all non-critical diplomatic exchanges. Wake every shipyard. That was it. No further speech. No call for discussion. No vote. Nobody argued. Not because no one had doubts. In a room full of 200 senior officers, there were certainly people with questions, with hesitations. But here is what I have come to understand about that silence. It was not agreement born of anger. It was agreement born of clarity. Every person in that room had spent their entire career working within a system that was supposed to protect what it had promised. And every person in that room had watched the night before, as the Verath Empire demonstrated that the system only protects you if you are powerful enough to make the protection real. Mara Vass had operated in good faith. She had filed her reports. She had used the proper channels. She had trusted the framework. And the framework had not saved her. The only thing that changes that calculation is power. Not the appearance of it, not the promise of it. Actual, demonstrated, undeniable power. The kind that makes the cost of an action like what the Verath had done immediately and obviously too high to ever consider. We had not shown that power in 847 years, and a species that does not show its strength for 9 centuries eventually stops being believed when it says it has any. On the shuttle back to the Endurance, I sat next to a young fleet captain named Owen Price. He was 30 years old. He had never served in any kind of conflict. He stared out the viewport for most of the journey, and about halfway through, he said quietly, more to himself than to me. "I always thought peace was just what things were," he said. "I didn't know someone had to keep choosing it." I did not answer him immediately. I thought about Lyria Vass 847 years ago, walking into a negotiation room and deciding what kind of species we were going to be. I thought about every generation after her that had made the same quiet decision. I thought about Mara Vass standing in that chamber in her worn uniform. Then I said, someone was always choosing it, we just forgot to notice. When I returned to the Endurance, Callum met me at the docking bay. He had clearly not slept. His eyes were steady though, clear, waiting. "Wake the crew," I said. "Full operational briefing in 2 hours. We have orders." He said, "What kind of orders?" I looked at him for a moment. "The kind that don't get undone," I said. He held my gaze for a second. Then he nodded once sharply, turned on his heel, and went awake the ship. I stood in the docking bay alone for a moment. The bay was cold and smelled of metal and propellant. Around us, across human space, 17 shipyards were powering up for the first time in living memory. The lights in the corridors of the Endurance shifted from standard white to the amber operational tone that signals elevated readiness. We were not at war yet. We were becoming something that would be ready for it. The first time I stood on the bridge of a fully armed Terran warship in active deployment, I noticed how quiet it was. That surprised me. I had expected something louder. Instead, the bridge of the Endurance hummed with the same soft, continuous sounds it always made. The air system cycling, the navigation arrays tracking, the communication channels open and waiting. My crew moved through their stations with calm, precise efficiency, the way they always moved. The difference was in their eyes. Every person on that bridge knew exactly what the amber lights meant. Every person had attended the full operational briefing. Every person had made their own private decision about what they were willing to do and why. None of them hesitated, not one. We were positioned at the edge of Verath-controlled space in a sector called the Aldara Corridor. It carried its name from the very agreement Mara Vass had helped negotiate 15 years earlier. The irony was not lost on me. The first zone of operation was the territory that Mara had spent part of her career trying to protect through diplomacy. Diplomacy had run out. The Verath garrison at Corridor Station 12 was not a major installation. Strategically, it was a checkpoint, a border enforcement post. It was staffed by approximately 300 personnel and 6 patrol craft. Akefer had chosen it deliberately, not because it was easy, because it was symbolic. It was a Verath installation built in space that the Aldara Corridor Agreement had designated as neutral passage. It was technically an illegal installation that had been tolerated, because we had been tolerating a great many things for a long time. We were done tolerating. I gave the order at 600 Standard Time. What followed was not the dramatic thing that people who have not been in military operations sometimes imagine. There was no shouting. There was no chaos. My weapons officer, a woman named Diane Park, confirmed targeting. My helm officer, a man named Leon Briggs, held our approach vector exactly as calculated. Callum coordinated with Owen's frigate over an encrypted channel. The engagement lasted 11 minutes. At the end of 11 minutes, Corridor Station 12 had been disabled, its patrol craft neutralized, and a formal notification had been transmitted to the Verath Border Command informing them that the station was in violation of the original Corridor Agreement and had been decommissioned accordingly. The notification also stated that any further installations in designated neutral passage zones would be treated the same way. That was not a diplomatic note. It was a statement of fact about what we were going to do. I sat in my command chair after it was done, and I took a very slow breath. Diane looked over at me from her station. She said nothing. She just looked. I think she was checking to see how I was. "All systems report," I said. She turned back to her console. Everything was functional. No damage sustained. All crew accounted for. I opened the fleet channel. "Endurance to Aldenmore, status." Owen's voice came back steady. "The Aldenmore is clean. Operation complete on our end. No complications." "Good," I said. "Hold position and await the next coordinate package." Callum was at my shoulder. He said very quietly, "That's the first one." "Yes," I said. "How many more?" I thought about the operational plan, about the 17 shipyards completing the first wave of new construction, about the 43 other installations across the outer reaches that existed in legal gray zones, about the fleet deployment orders already in motion. "As many as it takes," I said. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She would not have wanted this." He meant Mara. He was right. I had read her private logs by then, recovered from the Verath Chamber's own recording archive by an intelligence team that had moved very fast and very quietly in the hours following the execution. Mara had known for at least 2 weeks that the tribunal was coming. She had written in her log that she hoped the Verath would reconsider, that she hoped the charge would be quietly dropped, that she believed even then in the possibility that sense would prevail. She had not told anyone. She had not raised an alarm or sent a warning. She had not wanted to start anything. She had sat with that knowledge quietly and hoped the galaxy would be better than it was. It had not been. "No," I said. "She would not have wanted this. She wanted the peace." I looked out at the dark corridor of space ahead of us. But she also spent 30 years understanding exactly what we were capable of, and she trusted us to know when the time came. Callum did not reply. He went back to his console and began preparing the next navigation packet. Across human space, something extraordinary was happening. Species that had existed quietly under the shadow of the Verath Imperium for generations were sending signals. Some were formal messages of support. Some were unofficial, routed through civilian channels. Some were nothing more than the quiet repositioning of a neutral vessel out of a contested zone. A small gesture that said without words, "We are getting out of your way." What they were responding to was not our request for support. We had not asked for any. What they were responding to was the sight of something they had never seen before. Humanity moving. Not talking about moving. Not writing reports about the possibility of moving. Actually, directly, irreversibly in motion. A Verath diplomatic envoy arrived at Relay Station Delos 4 days later. His name was Consul Adravith. He was a senior member of their diplomatic corps, experienced and intelligent, and he arrived with the kind of calm confidence that comes from never having needed to be uncertain in a very long time. I was present at the meeting. I stood near the back wall and watched. Adravith made his opening statement. It was long and formally structured, and contained near the end the word proportionate. He suggested that the current situation, while regrettable, called for a proportionate diplomatic engagement that would allow both parties to return to a framework of managed relations. HFY did not respond immediately. She looked at him for a moment, then she laughed. Not a large laugh, not performed or theatrical, just a brief, genuine, quiet sound. The kind that escapes when something is so far from the expected shape of reality that the body produces a response before the mind can select one. Adravith went still. He understood in that moment that he had misread the room, not just the room, everything. He had come prepared to negotiate from a position of quiet authority, expecting to meet counterparts who were upset but ultimately manageable. He had expected the kind of meeting he had attended dozens of times. He had not expected to be assessed and found almost irrelevant. HFY let the silence sit for 3 full seconds. Then she said, in a tone that was entirely pleasant and entirely without warmth, "Consul Adravith, we are not here to negotiate what is proportionate. You executed a Terran general on a fabricated charge in front of 40 star systems. There is no proportionate response to that. There is only what comes next." Adravith said, "I must caution against escalation." "We are not escalating," HFY said. "We are correcting." She held up one hand very slightly. "We will tell you what we intend to do. Then you will carry that information back to your High Council. That is what this meeting is for." And she told him, calmly, clearly, station by station, zone by zone, the legal violations the Verath had been accumulating for 2 decades, and what we were going to do about each one of them. Adravith left 2 hours later. He looked like a man who had walked into a building he believed he knew well, and discovered an entirely different structure inside. On my way out, I overheard one of his aides say something to him in Verath that my translation unit caught as, "Were they always this?" Yes, I thought, we were. We had simply been choosing not to show it. We were done choosing that. The campaign moved fast after that. War, when it is real and sustained and large in scale, is nothing like the version that exists in the imagination. I had studied military history. I knew the theory. I thought I understood what it meant to be in a conflict that stretched across multiple star systems. I did not truly understand any of it until I was inside it. The Terran campaign against the Verath Imperium did not follow a single clean arc. It was a series of overlapping engagements, some coordinated, some reactive, some improvised in real time by officers making the best decisions they could with the information they had. I was part of operations in 6 distinct sectors over the course of 4 months. The Aldara Corridor was only the beginning. After Corridor Station 12, our fleet moved to the Own Passage, a commercial route that the Verath had been quietly taxing human and neutral shipping for 11 years. We dismantled 3 checkpoint installations there. Then we moved to the Cradle Sector border regions, where Verath patrol fleets had been making unauthorized incursions. Each operation was precise. Each one had a specific legal justification rooted in violations of agreements the Verath had signed and then ignored. HFY had insisted on this from the beginning. We were not simply retaliating. We were correcting a record that had been allowed to drift wrong for too long. But I want to be honest about something, because the record deserves honesty. It was also a war, and a war however justified in its origins, does things to the people who fight it. I felt it in myself. A kind of clarity that was efficient and focused and very useful, and also underneath something harder than I recognized as part of who I had been before. I made decisions faster than I once had. I moved through the calculations of an engagement without the hesitation that used to accompany them. I was good at what I was doing. That competence should have felt neutral. It did not always feel neutral. 6 weeks into the campaign, we captured the Verath Fleet Admiral commanding the Outer Reaches Division, a figure named Commandant Vrossolin. He was brought aboard the Endurance after his command vessel was disabled. He was treated correctly, in full accordance with the multispecies protocols. He asked to speak to me. I went to the secure observation deck where he was being held. He was sitting when I arrived, upright and composed. He looked at me with the particular attention of someone assessing a situation carefully. He said, "I want to understand something." I waited. "We executed one officer," he said. "One. There are political considerations I will not pretend were absent, but she was one individual. The response you have initiated is—" He paused. "Disproportionate." I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "She was General Mara Vass." He waited. "That is the entire answer," I said. He frowned. "That is not a strategic explanation." "No," I said, "it is not." He leaned forward slightly. "Then help me understand. We have fought species 3 times your number and twice your technological advancement. We have managed political situations of extraordinary complexity. We have dealt with threats and opposition for 400 years. Why does the execution of one human officer produce this response? What is the variable we did not account for?" I thought about how to answer him. I wanted to give him the honest answer, not because he deserved it, but because the question itself deserved one. "She mattered to us," I said, "not just as a general, not just as a diplomat, as a person, as someone who spent her life trying to keep what was good about the peace intact. And you removed her in a public broadcast, designed to show every species in the galaxy that we could not protect our own people." He said, "Species lose individuals. That is part of political reality." "Yes," I said, "it is. And we accepted that reality for 847 years. We filed grievances. We submitted reports. We worked within a framework that was not always fair because we understood that the alternative was worse." I paused. "The thing you failed to calculate," I said, "is that we were aware of what we were choosing. Every time we stepped back, it was a decision, not a limitation, a decision. When you executed Mara Vass, you did not break our capacity. You broke our reason for choosing restraint." Solon was quiet for a long moment. His expression was difficult to read. Not angry, not dismissive. Something closer to the particular discomfort of a person who has just understood a mistake that cannot be unmade. He said quietly, "We did not believe you would do this." "I know," I said. "We had 900 years of data, modeled responses, probability assessments. None of them projected. None of them asked what we wanted," I said. "They asked what we had done. That is not the same question." I left him there. The personal log of Mara Vass had been distributed to senior officers by then, with her family's permission. Her sister, a woman named Claire Voss, who lived quietly on a farming settlement in the Bellin system, had authorized the release. I read the log 3 times. Mara had been brilliant even in private. Her entries were clear and precise, and occasionally unexpectedly funny. She wrote about the food in the Verath capital. She wrote about a junior diplomat on her team who was, she said, going to be extraordinary. She wrote about the Outer Reaches reports, and her growing conviction that the situation was going to become serious. And she wrote this in an entry dated 12 days before the execution. "I know what they are planning. I have known for a week. I have not told anyone in the fleet because I do not want to be the trigger for what telling them would start. I believe in the peace. I believe it is worth protecting even at significant personal cost. I am hoping that they will decide I am not worth the political complexity. I might be wrong about that. If I am wrong, I hope the people who come after this understand that I did not think the cost was worth it. I still believe in the other option. I always will." I put the log down after that entry. and I sat without moving for a very long time. She had known. She had chosen silence to protect the peace, and they had done it anyway. I sent a message to my daughter that night. Her name was Nora. She was 17, and she lived with her mother on Bellin Station. I had not spoken to her since the campaign began. I wrote to her, "I am doing something I cannot be proud of and cannot stop. Remember that both things can be true. I love you. I will explain everything when I can." She wrote back 4 hours later. She said, "Dad, I know, come home." The conference room on Relay Station Delos had been prepared with the kind of careful attention to symbolic detail that only matters when everyone involved knows that symbols are all that remain to be settled. The table was circular. That was not by accident. A circular table has no head, no position of authority built into its geometry. HFY had specified it 3 days before the conference began. The station crew had found one in storage, moved it to the formal chamber, and polished it until it reflected the ceiling lights clearly. I sat 2 seats to HFY's right. She had asked me to attend as a witness and as a representative of the operational command. I had asked her once if she was certain she wanted me there, given that I had been one of the officers who had led engagements during the campaign. She had said, "That is exactly why I want you there." The Verath delegation arrived on time. 5 members. Their lead negotiator was a figure I had not encountered before, a woman named Counselor Vesa Iran. She was older than I had expected, white-haired and thin, with the deliberate movements of someone who had been doing complex things for a very long time. She did not look defeated. She looked tired. That was different. She sat across from HFY, looked at the circular table for a moment and said, "Good choice." HFY said, "Thank you." Then the work began. I will not walk through every hour of that conference. It ran across 6 days, with sessions in the morning and afternoon and on 2 occasions through most of the night. The details were technical and intricate and mattered enormously. Border definitions, passage rights, legal frameworks for addressing violations, the decommissioning of installations and the return of assets, the question of accountability for what had been done to Mara Vass. That last one was the hardest. On the 4th day, Counselor Iran sat back in her chair and said to HFY directly, without diplomatic framing, "We cannot undo it." HFY said, "I know that." Iran said, "What do you need from this negotiation in regard to that specific matter?" HFY glanced at me briefly. Then she looked back at Iran. "We need it to be impossible to do again," she said. Iran said, "Explain the mechanism you are proposing." And HFY laid it out. A provision to be written into the core treaty text. No member species of the Galactic Compact could detain, try, or execute a citizen of another member species without a multi-species judicial panel. No unilateral authority. No closed chamber proceedings. No broadcast executions, designed to send political messages to the watching galaxy. It would apply to everyone, including humanity. Iran listened to the entire proposal without interrupting. Then she said, "This removes a significant portion of the Imperium's sovereign legal jurisdiction." "Yes," HFY said, "it does. There will be considerable internal opposition." "Yes," HFY said, "there will." Iran looked at her steadily. "You understand that what you are asking will change the structure of how the Imperium has operated for 4 centuries. HFY said, "You executed a Terran general who spent her career protecting the peace between our species, and you did it on a public broadcast. You changed the structure of how we operate for 9 centuries. I think we are in a fair position to ask for a reciprocal adjustment." There was a silence. Then Counselor Iran said very quietly, "Yes, I suppose we are." The provision went into the treaty. On the 6th day, both parties signed the final document. It was given a name in the official record, the Vass Accord. I want to describe the signing room as I experienced it because I think the details matter. The room was quiet. The lighting was steady. The document was displayed on a formal projection surface, its text visible in 3 languages simultaneously. Standard Terran, Standard Verath, Galactic Common. The senior representatives signed their sections in sequence. When it was HFY's turn, she picked up the stylus and signed without hesitation. without ceremony, without a speech. Counselor Iran signed directly after her. They looked at each other across the table when it was done. Iran said, "This is not how we expected this year to unfold." HFY said, "Neither did we." Iran nodded slowly. Then she said something that I have thought about many times since. "I read the general's file," Iran said. "Her record, her work on the Aldara corridor agreement." She paused. "She was remarkable." HFY said, "Yes, she was. We made a significant error in judgment." HFY looked at her. "You made the error when you decided she was a manageable obstacle. You have been making that same error about humanity for a very long time." Iran accepted that without deflecting it. She nodded once, stood, and led her delegation from the room. The memorial service for Mara Vass was held 3 days after the signing, at the location of her execution in the Varath capital. The Varath government had agreed, as part of the accord, to designate the site as a permanent interspecies memorial, accessible to all, maintained in perpetuity. HFY gave a eulogy. It was short and precise in the way everything she did was short and precise. She talked about Mara's work, her record, the specific agreements and negotiations that bore her fingerprints even when her name was not on them. She did not talk about the campaign or the accord. She talked about the woman. Then I was asked to say something. I had not prepared remarks. I had tried to the night before, sitting in my bunk on the shuttle that had brought me to the capital. Everything I wrote felt either too large or too small for the actual truth of what I wanted to say. So I put the notes away, and I decided to simply say what I knew. I stood at the front of the memorial space. It was clean white stone and open to the sky. I looked at the assembled gathering: Terran officers, Varath officials, representatives of 6 other species who had sent delegations, and Claire Voss, who stood near the front in a plain gray coat and held herself with the composed stillness of someone who has been grieving for months and has learned how to carry it without letting it show. This is what I said. General Mara Vass spent 30 years understanding what peace costs, not in abstract terms, in specific, daily, documented detail. She knew what holding the line looked like when the line was a legal argument in a committee room. She knew what patience cost when patience meant letting something slide that deserved to be pushed back on. She chose it anyway, over and over, because she believed in what the peace was supposed to be. She was right to believe in it. She was right about what it was worth. And she was right, I think, to choose the way she chose even at the end. I will not tell you that the last 4 months were what she would have wanted. They were not. She wanted the other option. She worked for the other option until the last moment she had. What I can tell you is that she trusted us. She trusted that we would know the difference between choosing restraint and being helpless. She trusted that if the worst happened, we would carry it correctly. I do not know if we did. I know we tried. I know the accord carries her name because what it protects is what she protected her entire life. And I know that the best way to honor her is to make the framework she believed in actually work this time. Not because we are forced to, because we choose to. She always believed we could make that choice. I believe she was right. I stepped back. Claire Voss met my eyes from across the space. She nodded once. That was all she did, and it was enough. We left the capital the following morning. I stood on the deck of the shuttle as it lifted away, watching the city fall below us. The white stone of the memorial was visible for a moment among the buildings. Then it was gone. On the journey back, I wrote a long message to Nora. I told her everything I had not been able to put into the short notes I had sent during the campaign. I told her about Callum standing in the doorway of the operations room, about HFY's laugh in the meeting with Consul Adravith, about Owen Price holding position in the Aldara corridor and doing his job with steady hands, about Diane Park checking my face after Corridor Station 12 to see how I was, about reading Mara's log and sitting, without moving for a very long time, about 6 days at a circular table with people who had made a terrible mistake and were now being asked to help build something better, about standing at the memorial and saying the things I had not prepared. I said to her, I still do not know exactly what we were. I know what we had to do and why we had to do it. I know that Mara Vass deserved better than what happened to her, And I know that the accord is the closest we could come to making something meaningful out of it. I know that the peace is going to take work. The same kind of work it always took. Filing reports and attending committees and choosing again and again to use the framework instead of discarding it. I think we are better at that work now than we were before, because we understand in a way we did not before that the choice is always real, and the cost is always real, and someone is always paying it. Nora wrote back while I was still on the shuttle. She was 17 years old, and she wrote with the directness of someone who had been thinking hard about things while her father was away. "Dad," she said, "I read the Vass Accord, all of it. The legal language in the preamble and the provision about multispecies tribunals. I read it because you were part of making it happen, and I wanted to understand what it was. I think it is good. I think Mara Vass would have written something very close to this if she had been the one at the table. I think that is the best thing I can say about it." I read that 3 times. When I arrived back at the Endurance, Callum was waiting at the docking bay. He looked better than he had in months. The campaign strain was still in his face, but there was something else there too, a kind of settled quality, as if he had found a place to put all of it that was not quite resolution, but was close enough to be livable. He said, "How did it go?" I said, "We got the circular table." He blinked, then he understood and he smiled. It was the first time I had seen him smile in 4 months. We walked back through the amber-lit corridors of the Endurance together, and somewhere between the docking bay and the operations room, I felt the ship shift back towards something that was not quite ordinary but was aiming for it. The lights would go back to standard soon. The crew would begin the transition to peacetime operations. Reports would be filed. Fuel supplies would be reviewed. The slow, careful, necessary work of coexistence would begin again. 847 years of peace had died the moment that broadcast cut to black. The Vass Accord was not 847 years of peace recovered. It was something newer, and I hoped more honest. A structure that had been tested and had broken and had been rebuilt with the knowledge of where the breaks had been. A framework that now carried in its legal text the formal acknowledgement that the lives of people inside it were worth protecting, not because empires extended courtesy, because the law required accountability. It would still require choosing, every day, by everyone inside it. But choice was what we had always been doing. I sat down at my desk in the operations room. Outside the viewport, space was dark and still, the same as it always was, indifferent to human history, waiting for whatever came next. I opened my personal log. I wrote Mara Vass's name. I wrote the date. And then I wrote the last thing I needed to say for the record, for myself, for whatever version of the future might one day read it. We spent 847 years learning how not to be what we are. They spent 3 minutes proving we never fully forgot. And then we spent 4 months reminding ourselves that the hardest thing we can do is not what we are capable of. The hardest thing we can do is choose again to be something better. That is what she always believed we could do. I believe she was right.